Um, Hello everyone. My name is Pietro Manzella, and I am a senior research fellow at ADAPT, which is the Association for International and Comparative Studies in the field of labor law and industrial relations. We are gathered here today to discuss and share some of the insights of the book, The Future of Unions and Worker Representation, the Digital Picket Line, which was published in 2022 by Bloomsbury and authored by my colleague and ADAPT's longstanding friend, Anthony Forsyth. Anthony, thanks for being here. Anthony is a professor of workplace law at RMIT University, Melbourne, in Australia. His research focuses on collective bargaining, trade unions, union education, labor hire, and the gig economy. Let's give just a few details about the book. So this work considers 4 countries, namely Australia, the USA, the UK, and Italy, and investigates the examples of innovation and digital campaigning, which are enabling unions to build new forms of worker power and overcome decades of declining membership. Specifically, the study evaluates the response of unions in each country to falling membership levels since the 1980s. The book includes also analysis of union responses to the gig economy in the 4 countries referred to before, and the emergence of self-organized worker collectives to combat this exploitative business model. Now, while thinking about the structure of this event, we thought it would be interesting to involve in the discussion other international experts in order to represent the case that is examined in the book. So Australia, the USA, the UK, and Italy. For this reason, I'm very happy to welcome the other speakers who will join us today. So Ilaria Maroli, she is a colleague of mine at ADAPT. She's a research fellow at ADAPT, and her research interests concern collective bargaining, union representation, and industrial relations at comparative level. Professor Jane Holgate, she teaches at Leeds University Business School. Her areas of expertise include industrial relations, work and employment, inequality, migration, organizing, and trade unions. And Melanie Sims, professor at Adam Smith Business School at University of Glasgow. Her research focuses primarily on employer engagement with labor market policies, worker voice, especially trade union voice. Let me remind you that the event is hosted by ADAPT and the Scientific Committee of the E-Journal of International and Comparative Labor Studies, which is edited by Professor Philly. I'd like to remind you that the event is streamed live on the ADAPT YouTube channel. You can use that channel to pose questions, which I read to our speakers later on. For other work-related events and publications, you can subscribe to our international newsletter free of charge. Let me also thank you, the audience, now for being here, also considering different time zones. And I think we can start by leaving the floor to Anthony, who will present his work in terms of structure, methodology, and main findings. So, Anthony, the floor is yours.
Okay, grazie mille to all of my friends at ADAPT, and most of all, Ilaria Amaroli, who's worked to organize the event, and Pietro Manzella for chairing, and also to Professor Mcaleeby for kindly agreeing to host the event. I'm also honored to be speaking on the panel with, as Pietro said, Professors Melanie Sims and Jane Holgate, whose work on unions I've long admired, and I really thank you both for agreeing to be involved. So I'm going to try to distill the essence of my book in 20 minutes. Really, its central concern is the future of trade unions and how they can reverse more than 30 years of declining membership. And we know there's been a lot of academic study and literature of union decline I wanted to try and adopt a more optimistic project and to look beyond that fairly miserable tale and explore what unions can do and also how labour law features in the project of union revitalisation. As Pietro said, I chose 4 countries as the focus for the comparison. Now, 3 of them, the UK, Australia and the United States, share quite common experiences in terms of the factors that have contributed to union decline, including, of course, the neoliberal attack on unions and workers from employers and the state, and the strategies that unions have adopted to rebuild collectivism have also been quite common in these 3 countries. And in particular, since the early 1990s, the way that unions in these 3 countries have invested heavily in strategic organising, especially in private sector workplaces. So the US model of ground-up workplace-based campaigns to increase membership in sectors that had traditionally proved quite difficult for unions to obtain membership, like hotels and cleaning and healthcare and other service industries. But as we know, adoption of that model over the period since then has not led to any overall reversal of membership losses. In fact, continued decline in, measured by membership levels has been the case. Now, I chose Italy as the fourth country for comparison, not just because I love to travel to Italy and eat your wonderful food, but because unions in Italy have not suffered the extent of declining membership seen in other industrialized countries, and also not the same decline, I think, in industrial and associational power. Unions in Italy have a different relationship with the state, a greater legitimacy in society, more closely integrated in, for example, the delivery of government welfare programs. The very notion of unionism, I don't think, is as contested in Italy as it is in our 3 countries. Collective bargaining coverage is much higher still in Italy, at around 80% of the workforce. This reflects the institutional strength of the 3 major union confederations. In the national framework of social partnership, you have protections of freedom of association and the right to strike in your constitution, and also strong legal support for the role of unions at the workplace through the Italian Workers' Statute. And for these reasons, Italian unions generally haven't had to engage in bottom-up workplace organising of the kind we've seen in the other 3 countries to sustain their presence in firms. On the other hand, in Australia, the UK and the US, collective bargaining is focused on the level of the enterprise. There's very limited opportunity for industry-level bargaining. There are very weak protections against anti-union conduct by employers. So that gives rise to the union busting campaigns that we know are notorious in the US. They're happening now in the really startling, in terms of their success, current organising drives at Amazon and Starbucks, which I'm sure we'll talk about more as this seminar progresses. And also in these 3 countries, quite minimal protection of the right to strike. So in terms of union density and bargaining coverage, as I mentioned, Italy has clearly the highest level of bargaining coverage of the 4. Union membership is the highest at 33% of the workforce, but that does include a large number of retired members, which is not a feature in any of the other 3 countries. The UK has the next highest level of union membership at 23%. Australia is much lower, around 14% now, although collective bargaining coverage in Australia is around 30%. And of course, in the United States, we see the lowest figures for both indicators at 10% union density and around 11% bargaining coverage. So my book has 2 main areas of focus, or I guess what you could call research questions. The first, being a labour lawyer, that I wanted to inquire into is really what role does labour law play in accounting for union decline, and therefore how important is labour law reform in union revitalisation. In Australia, the UK and the US, to varying degrees, as well as the organising model, unions in recent years have focused on electoral politics, trying to secure more favourable laws from left or centre-left governments. In the US right now, the union movement wants President Biden to move forward with the Protecting the Right to Organise Act, which would address some of the many deficiencies in the National Labour Relations Act, which allow the kind of union busting tactics I mentioned earlier. There's not much chance of that law seeing the light of day, given the hopelessly divided state of the US political system and Congress. In Australia, before our last federal election in 2019, the union movement ran a very strong campaign called Change the Rules to try and fix limitations in our laws that give employers different opportunities to obstruct union organisation and bargaining. This was not successful ultimately because the Conservative government was re-elected for a third time. We're in the middle of an election campaign again in Australia. We have them every 3 years. And this is really a pandemic election. It's really about how well it's considered the government has managed the recovery from COVID, and workplace or employment issues are playing a significantly lesser role, even though we've now had about 10 years of fairly consistent, very low wages growth in Australia. And I know that in the UK, particularly around the periods that Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labor Party, there was strong union-based campaigns to change labour laws there too. So these political or legislative efforts on the part of unions raise important questions that I wanted to interrogate. I think a lot of union leaders have placed a lot of faith in the hope of labour law change to deliver the kind of recovery and making up for the loss of membership decline that we've seen in the last 30 years. What I wanted to look beyond that and examine was, and this is really the second main focus of the book, is really what about what unions themselves can do? What about union innovation? How are unions connecting with difficult to organise workers, particularly young people, those in precarious work, migrant workers, groups of workers that haven't traditionally joined, but make up increasing numbers of the workforce in all 4 countries. And so I draw upon the vast union revitalisation literature, and also in particular a paper by Professor Jeli Visser for the ILO in 2019 called Trade Unions in the Balance, to argue that unions in all 4 countries can return to a position of influence, maybe not the membership levels of the celebrated days of the post-war era, but certainly some recovery of membership levels and power if they commit to a number of things, including experimenting with new technology, forming alliances with other social movements, and being open to much less rigid forms of engagement or who counts as a member, and also redefining the purpose of unions to take it beyond just who is the current shrinking core of membership to the position of workers in the society as a whole and advancing outcomes for workers, whether they are members or not. So there are a lot of these innovations already happening, and the book looks at many examples of them in each of the 4 countries. I'll just mention a few. In Italy, it includes the development by the main confederations of specialist unions for precarious workers since the mid-2000s. So there's NIDL, there's FELSA, there's UIL Temp, and these are all aimed at representing temporary or agency workers, independent contractors, bogus self-employed workers, and freelancers. In Australia, there's been a really interesting experiment. One of our big unions, the United Workers Union, part of its coverage is hospitality and cafes and restaurants. And 5 years ago, it created a digital union called Hospo Voice to attract young staff working in cafes and restaurants, giving them the option, rather than the traditional proposition, which is pay us full membership fees to get the full range of union services, Instead, this said to young workers, pay us 10 Australian dollars a month, and we'll give you access to online tools that are tailored to help you deal with the problems that we know workers experience in this sector: sexual harassment, underpayment, and other forms of exploitation. And it's been very effective in exposing wage theft by some of the major restaurant chains, very prominent in the media. I guess the big question is whether it's actually led to any significant increase in membership, which I'll come back to in a moment. I know that in the UK, the Trades Union Congress developed its WorkSmart app, which I know Jane and Melanie have written about, which is another great example of the use of digital technology to try and reach young workers. And then, of course, in the US, we have the Fight for 15 campaign, a nationwide movement driven by the Service Employees International Union, aiming to pressure employers like McDonald's and Walmart to increase the minimum wage from the very low level of US $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour. And it's utilised direct action tactics, walkouts, sit-ins, street protests, mass media coverage, working with faith groups, working with those campaigning for racial justice, and has been successful in increasing the minimum wage through that pressure for almost 30 million American workers over the last 10 years. So this kind of approach, this what we might call a social movement unionism approach seen in the $15 campaign, has its proponents and it has its critics. And there's a lively debate in the US literature around this approach versus the traditional organising approach under the National Labour Relations Act. So Professor Kate Andreas, in a pivotal article in the Yale Law Journal a few years ago, sort of claimed that the Fight for 15 movement and others like it are a necessary response to the flawed National Labour Relations Act, and really engaging unions in a different kind of project from the traditional collective bargaining project, positioning them as co-negotiators with the state in determining working conditions for not just their members, but a much larger group of workers who are not members. US union organiser and activist Jane Mcaleeby has a very different view, and she's been very critical of the Fight for 15. Sure, it's achieved that one of its goals, which was to improve working conditions significantly, but it was also meant to be about signing workers up to unions. And on that count, it has not succeeded. Very few ongoing union members have resulted from it. And there are other examples from that disparate literature that I refer to in the book. One of my conclusions is that really there's no simple answer to that bifurcation of the argument, and it really isn't a binary choice, as the debate in the US tends to suggest. It's not a choice between this sort of purity of a statutory organising process, which in the US is certainly accessible to fewer workers all the time, and on the other hand, some promised land of campaign-based activist worker representation. To me, for unions in all three countries, both of those options are available and need to be pursued simultaneously, along with what I also examine a lot in the book, the use of technology as a bridge to build collectivism, particularly if we're trying to attract younger workers. So some of that argument is about how sustainable are these newer forms of unionism, and some skeptics as to whether they're very sustainable at all in the longer term. One of the other things I found in the book is that there are many examples of newer campaign-oriented unions that have developed into durable membership-based organisations. Some of the most striking examples of these are in Italy and also in the UK. So I look at the grassroots unions C-Cobus and ADL Cobus, so that have sprung up in the last 10 years or more, or become more active in that period. I guess in some ways filling gaps that have been left by the major union confederations particularly, for example, in representing workers in the logistics warehouses in the Po Valley, in this sort of central distribution area for the whole of Europe in terms of the number of warehouses and the amount of goods passing through them, where there's been a very high migrant workforce with shocking exploitation, including long working hours, intrusive surveillance and low pay, because the workers are predominantly engaged through cooperatives and labour hire companies that aren't covered by national collective agreements. And those unions have utilised the ability of those workers to choke up the supply chain by organising walkouts and other forms of protest that have, in some cases, led to improvements such as agreements to apply national collective agreements. The equivalent radical grassroots unions that I know, again, both Jane and Melanie have looked at quite closely in the UK are the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain and United Voices of the World, both aimed at representing vulnerable, again, predominantly migrant workers doing outsourced or bogus self-employed work like cleaning, caring, security guards, that kind of work, particularly in employment like universities and NHS hospital trusts. And of course, both of those unions have also been very active in representing gig economy workers for whom the tale of exploitation through a sham contracting model is another story in itself, which I devote 2 chapters in the book to. What these examples show is that some of the major success of unions recently has been in the most challenging, the most fissured work settings. And it's because of the emergence of independent member-led unions more prepared to take a confrontational position in response to the demands of marginalised workers. And so I also conclude that back to the organising model, I think it still is very valid and important. And people like Mcaleeby, and certainly you in your book, Jane, point to the many significant recent examples of successful deep organising drives. And we're seeing that again, as I mentioned earlier, in the US with Amazon and Starbucks. But union organising has had to evolve, and not enough unions have evolved the way they are doing organising. But this has to happen if unions want to attract younger workers for whom traditional forms of unionism can be alienating. They need to provide a range of options for becoming a member or forming a relationship with the union. And this would enable young people, those in precarious work and others, to engage in ways that suit them. The other main focus of the book that I won't go into in detail because my time is nearly up, but it's a significant part of the last chapter, which is the analysis chapter of the book, or the second last chapter. The last chapter is a brief detour into COVID and its implications. But what I look at there is that, back to the labour law question, I'm critical of union leaders who have focused unduly on the importance of changing the law as if that will fix all the problems. But I also can see that changing the law is important in itself. It's a necessary ingredient in union revival, although not a sufficient one on its own. And I look at the fundamental weaknesses in US, UK, and Australian law in particular that have to be addressed if unions and workers are going to have a fair chance of building and exercising collective power. And the key changes for which we can look to Italian law in some ways as a model include, we've got to move beyond the enterprise focus for bargaining. It has to be legally possible for workers and unions to organise campaigns to improve working conditions across multiple employers, across industries, across supply chains, and to be able to take industrial action in support of that. We have to give unions greater access to the workforce in recognition and bargaining campaigns, including the ability to communicate freely with workers. And we need workplace organisational rights. And this is where I think we can look at the Italian Workers' Statute and some of the provisions it has around the ability, for example, of unions to hold paid and unpaid meetings with the workers at the workplace. I mean, entry to the workplace to communicate freely on an even footing with employers is such a huge source of contest in the US. I know it is in the UK as well, and a significant barrier to the ability of unions to effectively organise. And one of the last things that I go into in quite some detail is legal changes to improve the position of gig workers, redefining employment so that it captures all of those who provide labour unless they're running their own genuine independent business, and also giving gig workers the opportunity to bargain collectively, which is restricted in all 4 countries, not only by labour law, but also by competition law. So I can conclude there. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the observations of the panelists and the discussion that we're going to have. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for such an insightful presentation of your book. It was a very interesting outline. Yes, we'll receive a couple of questions, but we can leave them until the end. So let me now leave the floor to Ilaria Armaroli, who will focus on Italian trade unionism, also relating it to what you have said in your book, in order to find out some common aspects or maybe some differences. So Ilaria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pietro, and thank you, Anthony, for your presentation. And I have to say that I particularly appreciate your book, which I find a passionate and scientifically grounded call for actions targeted to trade unions nowadays. And I also agree with the underlying thesis of your book that legislation is important, but not enough to support trade union renewal and success in representing new groups of workers, and that much of the work needs to be done by trade unions themselves also. And as I am from Italy and I know Italian trade unionism better than others, I will concentrate specifically on the Italian context, which, as also Anthony has already mentioned, is regarded in Anthony's book as a counterpoint to Australia, the UK, and the US. And precisely in this regard, I would firstly like to point to the fact that whereas today Italy and continental Europe also are often considered by Anglo-Saxon scholars and experts as models to aspire to, at the beginning of its formation in the 50s, one of the most representative trade union confederations in Italy, CISL, looked particularly at American trade unionism to find its ideological justification by borrowing some of the threats which ensured its membership growth and still characterize its purpose and action today, such as a focus on collective bargaining as a central trade union practice, a particular pragmatism and a commitment to industrial growth by counterbalancing the negative effects of capitalism without overthrowing it, and a strong belief in free and independent trade unions with no structural links with political parties. So I was wondering, who knows if Italian trade unions, which now seem to be essentially concentrated on activities deriving from their institutional legitimacy, like collective bargaining and tax and social security service provision, refer again to the UK and US labor experiences, this time to improve in organizing techniques. In so doing, they could also overcome what it looks like from your book, Anthony, a trade-off for trade unions, either boasting institutional support and largely focusing on traditional collective bargaining practices, except for few organizing experiences, or suffering from low institutional legitimacy and boasting time to develop innovative organizing practices even beyond the narrow field of employment relations. After all, I know that something similar has recently occurred in Germany, where IG Metall, for instance, borrowed some organizing elements from the American Service Employees International Union and adjusted them to the national context. But in the meantime, I would also like to ask Anthony, why did you choose Italy rather than other countries from continental Europe as a counterpoint to Australia, the UK, and the US? I mean, is there a specific reason for that? Because, I mean, you have already described some industrial relations feature of the Italian context, but these features can also apply to other contexts in continental Europe. So I would like to ask specifically why Italy? And my second consideration relates to trade union identity and what derives from it, which is, of course, a central element for trade union renewal, and it is also partly explored in your book. And notably, I would like to highlight the role possibly played in reaching new targets by trade union organizational structure, which is deeply connected by trade union identity and purpose, of course, and subsequently the collective bargaining system, which is organized by social partners themselves in Italy. Particularly, it has been observed, for instance, also by Chiara Benassi and Lisa Dorigatti in a recent article, that whereas continental European trade unions like in Germany and in Italy have been quite active in representing and regulating the conditions of agency workers, and this is also accurately argued in your book, Anthony, no similar encompassing and decisive efforts have been made in both countries with reference to workers employed in subcontracting chains, mainly because of two reasons. Firstly, these workers are often perceived as less impactful on the activities of core employees. And secondly, they are regarded as involved in domains relating to other sectoral trade unions. However, this might have contributed to the fact that also in Italy, which is sometimes a little bit romanticized in international industrial relations literature, workers' conditions at the bottom levels of value chains are often poor, with higher shares of undeclared work and the application of cheaper national collective labor agreements, regardless of the fact that they are signed by the most representative trade unions or not. Therefore, it can be argued that under no disadvantages, legal conditions for workers' representation, like in Italy, the collective bargaining system, which is still centered on the sector and the firm as the two main levels of collective bargaining in Italy, as well as the trade union organizational structure, which is mainly sectoral and occupational based in Italy, can provide serious obstacles to the representation and regulation of workers' conditions in low-end work settings. Notably, they seem to be unprepared to deal with certain transformations of work organization, such as workplace segmentation, by externalization of different activities relating to different sectors. And this is why a new and emerging collective bargaining field in Italy could be the supply chain level, involving negotiations between different sectoral trade unions and different companies. But although this level is already discussed in literature, it is still poorly developed in practice, with many associational and contractual limitations. Finally, my third point concerns the growing intervention of rank and file and independent trade unions and NGOs in new industrial relations fields. And an interesting case in this regard is that of youngsters and migrant workers, also addressed in your book, Anthony. Language, cultural, and residential barriers can compromise the capacity of Italian trade unions to recruit and organize migrants, for instance, in the agricultural sector. But whereas independent trade unions may have acted more promptly and innovatively than confederated trade unions and got also significant media and academic resonance, their results in terms of membership, institutional legitimacy, and also material outcomes for workers are sometimes questionable, at least in Italy. And their organizational structure still appears to be scantily developed, and they do not seem to be interested in participating in institutional social dialogue and collective bargaining tables, with the effect that their action resembles more that of NGOs. They organize protests, they send food to the ghettos where migrants live in Italy, than trade unions' action. So on the other hand, which we should also acknowledge the efforts of traditional trade unions, CGL, but also CISL, to make up for lost time by finally recognizing the increasing relevance of migrant workers in the sector and developing new technical skills, such as on immigration and housing policy, and also new relational skills in terms of language, communication, team building, to organize these workers. And in this sense, I think that it can be said that also traditional unions are getting closer to the sphere of action of civil society organizations. So I think that this situation encourages us not only to study how workers' organizations should update their action in the light of new workers' needs, but also to ask ourselves, without preconceptions and free from past assumptions, what trade unionism still means and what trade unions are for today. What are their objectives and do they achieve them? These should allow us, I think, to evaluate organizing practices performed by both traditional and new organizations through the relevant lens of trade union purpose, which is, of course, not something static, but it can be subject to change, and it can go even beyond the direct and bilateral employment relations. In this sense, Soraya Ruth has recently deployed the image of workers, employer and society relations in an effort to overcome the traditional concept of employment relationships and the inherent productivism bias, which she blames for having prevented for a long time labor regulation from casting proper attention to socially and environmentally sustainable forms of work. But I also think that the community organizing practices performed by the UK trade union Unite in relation to non-workers like students, unemployed, caregivers, on which also Jane Aldgate has written about, are likely to raise even more profound identity questions for trade union. These practices indeed seem to expand trade union purpose even beyond work and the working class, which has inevitably intersections between work and non-work related needs. And perhaps towards the identity, the broader identity sphere of marginalized social class, not limited to workers. And if I remember correctly, some of these considerations have been also mentioned in chapter 11 of your book, Anthony, especially in relation to the US case. And I do think that they should open up to further investigations and reflections in the literature in the near future. I mean, so thank you. These were my main points to Anthony's book, but also to the other guest speakers, which I wanted, to raise for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. I think that we can collect all the considerations from our speakers so that Anthony can reply to them at the end So now it's the turn of Jane Allgate. She will probably make some considerations about trade unionism in the USA. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you to Anthony for writing the book. It covers a topic which has been central to my own research over the last couple of decades, and it's always interesting to get a different perspective on the future of unions and figure out what's behind the successes and the failures of organising practice. So Anthony takes us through the turn to organising in the US, the UK, Australia and Italy, laying that sort of context of union decline in each country. And I think many of us are familiar with the figures, but I think it's important to keep reminding ourselves how much we've lost in terms of union membership. But for me, more importantly, actually union power, you know, in the US, as Anthony's just said, I'm going to focus on the US today, union density, which is often used as a proxy for union power, is just 10 or 11% and a mere 6% in the private sector. So I think we might all agree that we've got a serious problem, a problem that, you know, we've been unable to significantly address, I think, over the last 40 years. So I think the book is timely in the sense that we're at a period where workers have been taking a serious hammering from employers, and there's an even greater urgency than there was when the turn to organising took place over 40 years ago. And I think in a sense, the turn to organising that occurred in each of the countries, albeit in different ways, is almost historical now. So 2 generations have grown up, you know, since the 1980s, and many have seen little in terms of union militancy. And as an employment relations person in a university, I teach young people, and most arrive at my classes with no knowledge of what a trade union is or what they stand for. And I think that's part of the problem we face. Okay, so let me leave that there because I'll come back to later, as I want to focus on some of the issues that Anthony raises in writing about the US labour movement. And I think the book differs from many on union organising and union decline in that it uses that lens of employment legislation and the legal framework to consider, you know, some of the potential benefits and possible hindrance of employment law. And I think the hindrance of employment law is probably most starkly felt in the US. The legal framework there is particularly harsh compared to other countries. The National Labour and Relations Act supposedly provides some sort of protection for workers, but it's the practice is somewhat different, I think. I think it's still very easy for employers to fire at will and get rid of union activists in the workplace, and we see that all the time in the organising examples that we read about. The Act also provides a framework for union recognition, but the process is very long, it's very drawn out, with employers able to outfinance and undermine union recruitment. And as Anthony quotes, in no other industrial nation do employers fight so hard to defeat labour unions and the rights of individuals to be free from union involvement. And this has been prioritised over the goal of promoting collective bargaining, which does occur in other countries, or did occur in other countries. And just as an example, and then I'll come back to Amazon later, they spent $4.3 million in 2021 in attempt to prevent workers from organising. $4.3 million. That's a significant amount of money to try and keep unions out of your company. And you know, Anthony draws upon a number of case studies in the book, the Fight for 15, you know, the SEIU attempting to raise wages on a sort of industry-wide scale, geographical scale, to get beyond the difficulties of site-by-site organising. Then there's the Walmart campaign, attempt to organise the largest private sector employer in the US. Also, as it turns out, a virulent anti-union company. And then the teacher strikes were bargaining for the common good, and the future of education was designed to build community support for school teachers and the schools themselves. So appealing to the self-interests of parents and school children, very much connecting into that sort of form of social movement unionism that's already been mentioned. And all of these had significant wins. In the first case, it's estimated that the Fight for 15 resulted in something like pay rises for around 27 million workers. Walmart also resulted in pay increases, and the Chicago teachers' success, which won new contracts that included caps on class size, and nurses and counsellors in every school. That shifted the balance of power in the schools in the direction of the teachers, and it led to a series of others, teachers, taking strike action. But here comes the critique. These were all good initiatives and shouldn't be knocked at all, but they took vast resources from the union. We're talking millions of dollars. Or the knock-on effect of other workers following in their wake, except in terms of the teachers. I think that's a bit of an exception. In terms of the Fight for 15, workers in the main weren't unionised. Instead, the campaign was a campaign. It was central union-led. It was largely advocacy. And that, I think, is not organising to build workers' power. Similarly, the Walmart campaign was about attempting to damage the company's brand, reputational damage, which was part of the campaign. And it can be an important tactic, and it's not something that I would knock. But without worker engagement, it's only symbolic leverage. It doesn't really build power. And it cost around £7 to $8 million dollars to run that campaign, which is unsustainable without increasing union membership. Where is that money going to come from to organise other groups of workers? But I think what's different is that the Chicago teachers adopted a long-term organising programme years prior to their success. This was a deep organising involving rank and file workers. And a key element of the success was connecting workers' demands with those of parents and students. So what happened was it was a political as well as an industrial fight. And I think, there was real strength from that approach. It linked the union with the community, making workers feel less isolated and the authorities less able to divide and rule. And I think the way that they framed that issue was really keen. And I think we can learn a lot from looking at good framing campaigns. I suppose a downside of the wider teacher strikes was the failure to formalise the wins in collective agreements, making it easier to reverse some of those wins later. So I suppose what to make then of organising in the US? I think my question would be, should law reform be a priority for unions when thinking of building the union movement? I think my answer, and I think, they might share this with other people on the panel, is that no, not really. It doesn't mean that legal wins are not important and they're good for unions, and having good employment law is not, it's not to be sniffed at, as it were, but we should never rely on laws to protect us. In the end, it's workers' power that really counts. Laws on the protection of workers can be detrimentally amended or removed altogether. And we've all seen that in each of the countries that are looked at. And history shows us that employers will only respond to workers' demands when they're forced to through collective organisation. That is when we shift the balance of power through industrial action and able to extract concessions that way. So I don't have much longer, but I just want to make a few quick points that we could perhaps discuss in the question and answer session. You've all probably heard about the recent win by Amazon workers at Staten Island, and I'm sure you'll join me in congratulating the Amazon Labour Union in the David and Goliath fight for their union to be recognised. It was truly amazing work, given the anti-union tactics they encountered. As I said earlier, Amazon spent $4.3 million trying to keep unions out of the company, and they weren't successful. But the workers organised from the grassroots following a textbook organising drive meant that they spoke to every worker, countering the union busting lies put out by the company. But that was just stage one. And I think the next stage will be to win the contract and then organise to win concessions from the employers. So they've only won in terms of getting recognition at the moment. There's a lot more work to be done. So just a couple of points to finish then. One is that I think there has to be a much greater focus on power in labour unions. More power analysis is needed if we're to understand where power lies, what our power as workers is, how do we change the balance of power, and crucially, how do we hold on to it? Again, it's not something that we consider much because we think about the fights we're involved in at that time, but not about how we hold on to power. Secondly, it's that continuous organising that sort of needs to be taking place within unions, not just around an issue. Secondly, I'd argue that unions seldom set out expectations of their members. And in effect, there's no social contract or expectation of us as union members. It's still the case that members expect the union to do something for them. And I would argue this comes about because that's the message that unions implicitly give out. They sell themselves as advocacy organisations, even when they try not to. Unions need to present a credible vision for winning, otherwise members become sceptical and disillusioned. And I think I could apply this to my own union at the moment. There needs to be a realistic or convincing theory of change about winning in campaigns, and members need to be part of that strategising. So the final point is that unions need to involve and trust their members more in strategy and planning. If we look historically, then the biggest wins in unions come from rank and file activity, from the mass involvement of workers, not from the top down. And organising is hard work. Anybody who's involved in this knows it takes a lot of time, and it means building strong relationships in each and every workplace. Anthony mentioned Jane Mcaleeby, union organiser and writer on unions and strikes. She argues that there are no shortcuts, and I think I tend to agree with that. It is hard work that goes on, and it doesn't stop. So I'm going to leave it there. So thanks to Anthony for the book and provoking further discussion on the topic. I think it's a subject that's more needed than ever, and I look forward to the discussion and the questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. So it's now the turn of Melanie Sims. She will consider the UK case. So without further ado, Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And many of my comments, unsurprisingly, echo some of the comments that have already been made. So I've been rapidly editing as I've been going along to try and focus on some of the points that don't overlap, but almost inevitably I will echo some of the points made by Ilaria and Jane. And I commend Anthony on writing such an interesting and accessible book. I share your hope that I can remain optimistic when we think about and analyse union futures, but I also recognise what a tough job that is. It's non-trivial, that the challenges facing unions and facing workers are so enormous that it is quite difficult to remain optimistic. And I think you have broadly pulled it off in the book. And I also have to confess that when I was asked to read a book written by a lawyer, I had some perhaps disciplinary prejudices and assumed it might be a bit drier than it in fact is. And it's very far from being a dry read. Very accessible book, and I hope it will be read certainly far wider than just the labour law community, but actually also I think it would be perfectly possible for practitioners to pick up and read as well. So I would encourage people to do that. As others have mentioned, it's a wide sweep through organising and revitalising tactics of unions in the 4 settings. And it provides a really strong overview of the key developments in each setting, showing how many of the challenges and responses have been quite similar in those settings, despite some of the significant differences, particularly of labour law, but also of institutional regulation. And I think it's that point about similarity that I'm interested in. And it strikes me that there are 2 main reasons why we're seeing similar responses by lots of unions in very different institutional settings. And the first is what organisational theorists call in their fancy terms mimetic isomorphism. So to put it in plain language, learning from each other. And unions, I think, have been surprisingly good at that. When I started researching union organising maybe 25 years ago in the UK, I think there were lots of questions as to how useful it would be to even think about what the US movement was doing because of the very different institutional settings. And actually over 25 years or so, I think we've really developed a body of knowledge which shows the consistency of what works. Yes, there are differences, but as James just outlined, the commonality of what works and the common challenges as you sort of build bottom-up member engagement with the structures of the union, with the structures of labour law, with the structures of institutional regulation, how those all come into tension, for example, at various points. These are common challenges and common patterns around the world. And I think as a result, we've really had 25 years of being able to figure out what works. We're pretty clear about what works, certainly in the academic literature, and I think also in the practitioner literature. And unions have been remarkably good at learning those lessons. I think 25 years ago, we were probably all a bit more pessimistic about their ability to learn, let alone their ability to learn from each other. So I think there's reasons to be optimistic there, but I also think that explains some of the similarities of responses that we're seeing. But I think there's a second set of reasons why we see similarity in union responses, and these are not mainly the focus of your book, and it would be entirely reasonable to say, well, I'm focused on unions, but I think employers are a really crucial part of this story, and I think it's important when we think about trade unions to remember their secondary status. They are ultimately secondary organisations. They exist as countervailing pressures to capital. And the work of unions, the decisions of unions, always therefore needs to be understood with capital as the reference point. And I think one of the things that shapes the similarity of responses that Anthony's book outlines is the particular ways in which capitalism, particularly international financialized capitalism, has developed in the last 30 to 40 years. And you can kind of see the echoes of this through the book. It's not a criticism, I think, that I don't imply it as a criticism that capital isn't attended to, but it's definitely a key part of the story about why we see some of the things that we see. So partly, I think the increasing amount of international capital flows compared to, say, 30 or 40 years ago explains some of these similarities of pressures and challenges that unions face. Growing international capital flows almost inevitably always brings pressures of undercutting labour regulation in countries where it's stronger. In the UK, we've seen that particularly strongly. Starting in the 1980s, had strong policy decisions to attract foreign direct investments, a little bit more problematic these days, but certainly that's been a deliberate set of policy choices by the UK state, accompanied by and partly supported by that state attack on the institutions of collective labour regulation that we saw in the UK in the 1980s and running into the 1990s. Taken all together, that means that the UK has been one of the national contexts where labour has taken a particularly hard hit from a set of state policies that were primarily, in my view, targeted at privileging capital and secondarily intended to reduce the power of labour. Relatedly, absolutely fundamental to the primary objective, but I think it's quite hard to argue that the primary objective was around labour. It was primarily around privileging capital. Secondly, I think more recently we've seen something very interesting happen, which I don't think we are paying enough attention to as a community of scholars, and I think we really need to understand better. And it's the sources of value extraction in some of these new contemporary organisational forms, which seems in some settings to have moved away from labour as the primary source of value extraction. So we've seen capital invest heavily in forms of disruptive business models, and particularly platforms, for example, many of which have failed to make money for really a very, very long time. Capital has been remarkably patient in supporting these very disruptive technologies. And that brings surely a question about why. And I think there's two sort of sets of two places where capital is seeking alternative value extraction. One is in the actual IT architecture. In the UK, we have a well-known supermarket delivery company, so not a rapid delivery, just normal weekly grocery delivery company called Ocado, which has been loss-making for nearly 15 years. And its primary objective has been to build the basic IT architecture, which it can then sell to other retailers, and has proved very, very successful in testing how the market wants to engage with these kinds of technologies. So the IT architecture itself can be really quite profitable for some of these companies. But of course, there's also the data. We're in an era where we often talk about data being the new oil, and data, not just about the users, but about the workers, I think is one of the biggest challenges for trade unions in these new forms of capitalism. And I think there is something genuinely new about the way capital is behaving, and particularly where capital is seeking its value extraction. And I think unions have a lot of challenges in that space to think about how we secure fair usage of data, how we secure transparent usage of data, certainly for workers, but actually I would argue for customers, for users as well. And there are some really big things to think through there for unions about how we engage with employers who are primarily, or at least centrally, interested in the value of data rather than the value of labour. So I think these models, these new models, have lots of interesting things going on, and they can mean that in some settings labour can be less of a priority for the employers, for the recruiters, they're not always employers, than more traditional forms of organising and more the traditional forms of employment. And I think that brings us real challenges with regard to thinking about how we organise and thinking about how employers are incentivised to resist, and in what ways they're incentivised to resist unionisation. It makes rebuilding that collectivism that Anthony calls for really challenging. And I've argued this in other papers particularly with my colleague Joe Grady, where we argue that this form of financialised capitalism not only creates a setting in which the financial objectives of the organisation, the employer, take precedence over the kinds of long-term deals that would be necessary to build and deliver secure employment. But also the financialisation of everyday life brings different material interests into workers' lives. And both of these things together can make it more difficult for unions to express and articulate and build the kind of solidarities and collectivisms that Anthony calls for, and which I agree are absolutely fundamental for thinking about how we organise in a sustainable and long-term way. What we also see is that when these business models hit the kind of legacy institutional arrangements and labour laws and collective bargaining arrangements that still exist around some areas of Europe, we do see a clash with between the sort of Silicon Valley imagined future and the reality of working life and regulation of work and employment in Stockholm, Stevenage, Salzburg, wherever. And we've seen time and time again that European legislators have found that these kinds of workers are workers. Not every case has been one, but the good old-fashioned labour law that existed even in the UK has established that these workers are workers, and they are entitled to rights such as holiday pay, sick leave, and similar. The details of cases varies in different settings. But I think it has shown that the legacy institutions have actually relatively effectively challenged the worst excesses of these kinds of Silicon Valley disruptive tech kind of ultra flexible gig work type models. Which isn't to say we don't need better regulation, both of capital and of these forms of labour, but it does show how even very weak existing laws can be disruptive to this kind of aggressive form of capital, and have over time constrained some of the worst excesses of these kinds of working practices. So just a few concluding comments. I mean, one is the point that James made very effectively, which I won't dwell on in great detail, both because it's implicit in what I've said, but also Jane has articulated it well, which is addressing Anthony's question about what happens after the campaign ends, the need to think about the sustainability of organising activity in what is an expensive and resource-intensive set of activities. So how do you sort of keep that sustained action once the attention of the organising focus has sort of been won or been diverted or just petered out for whatever reason? I think there's a very important set of questions there. I think the other set of the questions that we really need to understand, and particularly in the UK labour market, although we see it in other settings as well, is the structures of our labour markets. So here, the UK, the question about organising low-paid workers, and particularly young workers, migrant workers, etc., is in no small part explained by the structure of the labour market in the UK. In other words, these workers are far more likely to work in sectors that are ununionised and low paid, so hospitality, retail, care work, etc. And it's very difficult to unpick whether they're low paid because they're young, or they're low paid because they work in the care sector or the hospitality sector, or whether they're all low paid in those sectors because it's very, very challenging for unions to get a foothold. Small workplaces, high labour turnover, those kinds of things. So here, and particularly in the UK, I think there is an argument for the kind of sectoral regulation that Anthony talks about, not just sectoral collective bargaining. I think there are other ideas from around the world as well, and also from our own labour history. And then I continue to argue for this kind of intervention at every opportunity. I think it's a really good example of where the law really could help extend worker representation and workers' rights in some sectors that are just hugely difficult to organise. And the kinds of independent unions that Anthony discusses are important at drawing attention to key issues, but they are very small scale in relation to the size of these sectors that dominate the UK labour markets. And of course, they're the sectors that kept us going during COVID. And COVID really exposed some of the problems of the lack of collective regulation in these sectors. These workers were exposed to enormous health and safety challenges, and were reliant on organisations such as our peak level umbrella organisation, the Trade Union Congress, speaking for them rather than actually a well-organised response. So without that kind of long-term sustained effective organising, the interests of these workers in the longer term, it will always be challenging for unions to organise and represent them effectively. So I'll sort of finish there. I mean, I really do applaud Anthony in this book for keeping an optimistic outlook. I personally do try to keep, it's in my instinct, I'm naturally quite an optimistic person, but I do sometimes find it very difficult to be optimistic when we really look at the dynamics of that kind of financialised capitalism that has been so privileged by the kinds of policies and laws that our policymakers have pursued for so long now. And I do sometimes find myself wondering about the scale of activity that would be needed in order to really fundamentally shift the dial on that kind of financialised, that trend towards that financialised, destructive, aggressive capitalism that many of our sectors are experiencing. So I'll stop there and pass over back to the...
Thank you, Melanie. So I think that Anthony has a lot to say concerning your observations and considerations. So Anthony, back to you.
Sure, and I'll try and keep it fairly brief because we do want to hear the questions from the audience and talk about those. So I'll just pick a few points from what you've each said, and I first want to say how grateful I am for your generous comments on the book and the project that I undertook. And I'm glad that it's not too much of a dry read for the non-labour law academics. But certainly my intention was that it would be read beyond labour law and even beyond industrial relations and management scholars, and predominantly by unions and union officials. And I was pleased to be able to do the launch of the book at our trades hall across the road from where I'm sitting a few weeks ago. So I'm hopeful that they are going to engage with it too. So to Ilaria's comments, I'll just respond to two. The question as to why I chose Italy rather than another continental European country really comes down to a mix of reasons, some personal and some scholarly. I guess I've just always had a very long-standing interest in Italy generally, and certainly in the last 20 years as an academic in the Italian industrial relations and labour law systems. So that drove my interest. And I guess I could have looked at Germany. I could have looked at any number of other European countries. I had already done that in my PhD coming up to 20 years ago, which looked at the German system of co-determination in particular and workplace-based representation through works councils. So I guess I wanted to choose a different focus. And to me, the ways in which the Italian case contrasted, I think, enabled me to make the kind of comparison that I wanted to make. But also being able to pick up on some of the similarities in terms of, I said union decline measured in membership terms hasn't been as pronounced, but you've certainly seen in Italy a lot of the other factors that have driven, not as intense, but certainly elements of employer opposition to the role of unions. And so that was something that I thought also would be fruitful in terms of making out the comparison. The second point of yours, Ilaria, I wanted to respond to was your observation that the growing intervention of the independent unions that I referred to has been fairly marginal in terms of the outcomes they've been able to produce and their non-participation in social partnership dialogue and other, I guess, institutional forms of advocacy and representation. And I think it connects with the point that Melanie made towards the end of her comments around the two independent unions in the UK, that they're important to consider, but small scale in terms of the size of the workforce and the problems that they're dealing with. I think they're all valid observations about my view that I convey in the book about the importance of these examples. And I have to admit that it is a little impressionistic, the conclusions that I have drawn. And I guess it comes back to the first point about why I chose Italy. As much as my interest and the reasons for the comparison drove it, it was quite a stretch for me to include Italy in the comparison because my Italian is not good enough to utilize Italian literature. So I was really left with what is available in English. And once I dug a bit deeper, there was more of that than I expected to find. But it perhaps means that the account is a little uneven in the sense that there is a vast or much richer depth of literature that I was able to draw upon in relation to the other three countries. In relation to Jane's comments, I just want to say that I enjoyed your book, Arise, so much. I wish I'd seen it in time to refer to some of your arguments. I think the books complement each other really well because of my focus on the legal and institutional framework. There's little attention to the power analysis that you provide and the way that you draw out the importance of workers and unions deploying moral and associational and coalitional power in combination with economic power, the ability of workers to withdraw labour. I mean, we can see it on display, as we've talked about right now in the examples in the US and those that we've talked about in the UK and Italy. In Australia, our United Workers Union is, despite the limitations of our legislation, really working hard to utilise ballots for industrial action as a basis for winning above inflation wage outcomes, and that's in sectors like logistics and warehouse and food manufacturing. The Transport Workers Union is doing the same in some of their recent campaigns and the work they're doing in the gig economy. Just a couple of points I'll respond to from what you said, Jane. I mean, the size of the employer counter to what unions are trying to do. You mentioned the Amazon campaign and the $4.3 million and let's not forget the $200 million that the gig platforms spent on the Californian campaign to overturn, one of the most novel and innovative attempts to try and overcome the sham contracting model of the gig economy through the ballot that they succeeded in winning to overturn that legislation 2 years ago. The examples that you mentioned that I focus on in the US, which I think you sort of described as people like Mcaleeby have as sort of largely advocacy, symbolic outcomes as opposed to really strong leverage. I think that's definitely an accurate description. And in Australia, we one of the ambitious, newer, innovative campaign-based small unions that's trying to do similar things has said to me that they don't have an ambition beyond that campaigning and activism. They consider that, succeeding in drawing attention to what they're doing in the media is almost the goal in itself, and they're doing quite well. And they can't see how they would move beyond that to a bargaining union that would take industrial action. And this is a union that's mostly focused on young workers. So I think there's a problem with sort of building the link between this new generation of tech-savvy activist-type union officials who are succeeding in some ways, but linking them to the wider project of sustained collective bargaining-focused unionism as well. Around Jane's point about law reform and where it sits within the range of priorities for unions, I agree with you that the law itself can't deliver the final outcome. I do think it is still quite important in what it says to workers about what's possible for them. So any improvements we could obtain in legislation, I think, have to be pursued. I guess where I'm critical, and I think it sounds like you are as well, is that some union leaders have placed so much emphasis on that. And if we're talking about the competing resources that unions have, or the competing calls on those resources, it's a question of how much you devote to those kind of political campaigns compared to the workplace-based activism. And so finally to Melanie, thank you again. As well as Jane's previous work on unions, the UK chapter of my book is full of references to your extensive studies of UK organising over the last many years. And I sort of draw upon the story that you've told, and it's a similar one in Australia, of the initial promise and the early successes of the organising model, and then over the longer term, its minimal impact. If we're talking about the result being membership, but also the fact that so much of organising was focused only on membership. And I think you and your work have really outlined so clearly how, the focus of so much of that US-driven organising approach was about signing people up, getting recognition, and then not enough attention being devoted to the second part, which is where Amazon and Starbucks unions are now, which is, okay, we've got recognition, we've got a good increase in support from members. How are we going to deliver for them in terms of translating that into power? And I really enjoyed reading Jane Mcaleeby's article in The Nation a couple of days ago, where she says the challenge for Amazon now is to win this second ballot that's happening at the moment, and then organise the workers as if a strike is going to occur. Yes, Amazon will challenge, they'll go to the courts, they'll try and derail the result, but the union has to act as if bargaining is happening and equip its workers to be in the position to take industrial action if needed. The last thing I'll just quickly respond to is your points, Melanie, about the capital employer side of the equation. And yes, I don't devote a huge amount to it, certainly not in terms of what you've mentioned about capital flows and the evolution of capital. What I've talked about, which I think is really important, is the evolution of capital in terms of the nature of the employing entity, and the way that has evolved so much as a deliberate attempt really to advance sort of 1980s union busting in new ways by saying, well, this employer doesn't actually have any relationship with the workers, whether it's a franchise or whether it's through agency work. Now it's through gig work. I mean, gig work is really just the latest manifestation of all of those others that we've seen over this period that we're talking about. Unions have been in decline. And I think they fit hand in glove because it's a huge part of the story of how employers have been so successful in being able to obstruct the development of worker power through unions and otherwise. So I'll leave my responses there, and hopefully we still have some time to hear from the audience.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Anthony. Yes, there is one question from the audience, which I think refers to the Italian context. The question is, what is the role of the tax and social security services provided by the Italian trade union? I don't know which one of the discussants now might answer this. Maybe Ilaria and then Anthony might have something to say about that.
Yes, I can say that, of course, in Italy, as I have also mentioned in my speech, tax and social security service provision constitute an important branch of the activity of trade unions, and at least the confederated traditional trade unions, the most representative ones. I think that this part of the trade union activity is very, very important. We know that it employs many officials within the trade union structure that perform this kind of activity, and it can also be a channel for trade union membership. The only issue, and this is an issue which is also, I know, long debated also within the trade union movement in Italy, is relates again to the sustainability and long-term trade unionism, and also what Jane calls worker engagement. I mean, service provision is very important, and it can allow trade unions to recruit new members, but sometimes these members are not engaged in other ways than asking for a service. So of course it is important, but it must be linked with a broader vision of the trade union purpose, and people who access the trade union through service provision, through the channel of service provision, needs, if I mean the union wants to maintain them in their sphere, they need to be engaged also in other activities, and so I think that this is a key issue, and is also debated and discussed within the trade union movement.
Yeah, my understanding is that Italian unions, through offices of the major confederations that are locally based, provide advice on tax, unemployment assistance, access to welfare services for union members. And one of the reasons I thought it was important is that in a lot of the literature that I examined around the post-war evolution of the major union confederations, this was considered to be part of an important part of the reason that union membership in Italy prospered so much in the post-war period, and part of the reason that it has continued to remain relatively high in international terms. And I mentioned the fact that a large number of members of the union confederations are pensioners, and so this assistance continues to be provided even after a worker has finished their active involvement in the labour market. And to me, it was a really important part of what distinguishes the Italian case from the other three countries. As far as I'm aware, there's not really a similar role in an institutional framework sense for unions providing these kind of services in any of the other three countries. I know that unions like Unite through the Community Initiative have started to do that more in the UK, but that's of fairly recent origin. But to me, it was really pivotal in explaining why in Italy unions came to be, and in relative terms still are considered to be quite legitimate in terms of their role in society, known and accepted by a large proportion of the population. And it even has an international presence. So my understanding is that some of these services are provided by what you call patronati. And we have patronati offices here in Melbourne, because in Melbourne we have one of the largest Italian migrant populations from the post-war immigration period in the entire world. So you see patronati offices around different parts of Melbourne. So to me, it's a fairly interesting and unique experiment in the really constructive role that unions can play for the wider working class.
Thank you, Anthony. I have two questions, which are probably quite general. In terms of union revitalizations, have you noticed now some initiatives now that can be transposed also to the other countries you examined? And still the same issue in terms of reviving the unionism in the countries you have investigated. What is the towards unions? Have you observed some sort of probably reluctance or how to say willingness to join the union, or some differences at the national level?
Yeah, some of the second part of your question I missed because it was breaking up a little. So I might answer the first part and then we might come to the second. In terms of transposing to other countries or adaptability outside national contexts, I think I can see a lot of similarities in the movement to community organising and social movement unionism in the UK and the United States. I think that's something a bit like organising that came a bit later to the UK, that had been really, that was actually part of organising in the original SEIU, AFL-CIO model of organising, was the idea of moving outside the workplace, unions connecting with the groups where workers or that workers inhabit when they're not at work, in their churches, in their wider campaigns on other issues. That hasn't been adapted as much as far as I can see in Italy. There are elements of it, and nor has it really been to the same extent in Australia. The other thing that I think is quite adaptable across countries is the use of technology. And it's happening again to varying degrees. I think Australia and probably next the UK are among the leaders in the use of what we're now calling worker tech. So the idea of, I mean, this is part of the challenge for unions, is to reconsider even what a union looks like, particularly to a younger person. And the fact that younger people, generations X and Y, as I talk about in the book, are digital natives. Their default way of finding out information and becoming active in campaigns like School Strike for Climate is through their phones. And we've seen some of the really innovative use of technology in these ways, particularly in union and self-organised worker responses to gig economy exploitation. So turning the technology that platforms use to surveil and performance manage workers back on them as an organising tool. And yeah, I mentioned Hospo Voice, the idea of a digital union. Some of the UK unions and some of the think tanks like Unions 21 in the UK are really heavily across this idea of how we can use technology. Obviously, there's a lot of that happening in the US as well. It may be happening in Italy in ways that I don't really know about. But the final thing I would say about that is there is a trap in this move to technology. It's the same as the trap around organising being the answer 30 years ago or legislation being the answer. Technology itself is not the answer. It is an important new tool that the more clever, innovative unions should be using as a way to connect with workers. But it's not a substitute for connecting with workers. It's the way you bring them in, attract them to what you're trying to achieve. But then it's just another tool that the union would use to move workers towards collective action. I'm not sure what the second part of your question was, Petra.
Yeah, the second question concerned the attitude of the younger generation of workers. I mean, have you noticed some differences in their approach? Maybe they are reluctant to join, or maybe they may be willing to join. So that was the question mostly.
Yeah, sure. I think around the world, and this is where Jelle Visser's paper that I mentioned is really interesting to look at, and in a lot of the literature, this is considered the fundamental challenge, I think, for unions globally, is overcoming the disinclination of young people to join, which has a number of reasons. Jane pointed out the fact that so many of the people you teach, it's the same for me here. When you start talking about unions, their eyes glaze over. Some of that is around an impression that they have of unions being antiquated, distant, irrelevant. So I think that this is a really important thing that unions have to grapple with. The use of technology is one of the answers, which I was just talking about, is what does the union look like? How is it making its approach to the workers? So if you can do it through an app, which is something that they're very familiar with using as an entry point to what the wider union can offer. But I think it's also about how a union looks in terms of who are the union officials, who are the people that are being put in front of these workers. And in a lot of the sectors like hospitality and other areas where young people tend to work while they're studying or because that's their only option in the labour market, the union official that's talking to them has to be someone that looks like them. So I know towards the end of your book, Jane, you talk about diversity in the union officialdom. And I know that's something that quite a few of the Australian unions have been working very hard to transform. The other thing that I talk about, and I'll just end on this point in the book about how we address this problem of young workers, is there is quite a lot of research on how you can attract younger workers to unions. And it seems that they will join based on two things. One is if it aligns with their values. So if it's an organisation that they think is going to progress the kinds of agenda around LGBTQI rights or climate change or racial justice that they're interested in. So it's not just an industrial union, but one that stands for what they stand for. Because if the values don't align, then that's very off-putting to them. But the second point is it going to get me what I want? Is it going to achieve the outcome that I'm looking for? Is it going to improve my conditions? Or the fact that I'm encountering sexual harassment in the workplace. So outcomes-driven values are also really important for younger workers. And young workers, we can often assume are not as interested in politics, but things like what young people have done around climate change around the world show us they care deeply about values, and unions have to connect with that and use it as an opportunity to attract them.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Yes. Yes, we are 6 minutes late. I think that as there are no other questions from the audience, we can end the discussion here. First of all, let me thank the author of the book, Anthony, once again, for giving us the opportunity to discuss his insights. Also, many thanks to Ilaria, Melanie, and Jane for helping us to get more into detail as far as the book is concerned. Yes, I think we can finish here. Thanks also to our audience. And you can find the recording of this book lunch on the Adapt YouTube channel. Once again, thank you all of you, and stay safe.